This is officially our last lecture, and thus I'm not even going to go through the pretense of putting our usual time chart there, and instead attempt something resembling summing up. Okay, so we start off. An awful lot about what this course has been about is when, what's the cause of why did this behavior occur? What are the explanations? And we go through our obligatory 1 second before, 1 year before, etc. In between those lines, a lot of what we're often asking is not only why did that behavior occur, but was it volitional? What control do we have over our behavior? And my deepest desire is that lots of you will come out of this class perhaps questioning the notion that free will is a widespread thing. My personal lunatic stance is that there's no free will whatsoever. And I think that should inform everything we do. But hopefully, seeing where all these different influences are coming from makes the notion of any of us as agents of our own fate, people who have earned our position, people who deserve anything that we've gotten here by anything other than biological luck, interacting with environmental luck. That's been my secret or not so secret goal throughout the whole class. And that's very much in the context of what is a Western tendency, which is when saying, why did that person do that behavior? Why is it that this or that happened? Often what is actually being said is, whose fault is it? Who is to blame? Why has this unacceptable behavior occurred? Which is where we sure barrel into free will type stuff. Why did that behavior occur? Who's to blame? And studying, like, I don't know, in the last 400 years of Western culture and Western medicine and such, one of the things that's gone on is revelatory breakthroughs in figuring out who's at fault for something or other. For example, 400 years ago, in virtually every Western European country, if you had an epileptic seizure, there was a medical diagnosis for what caused it, which is you've been in cahoots with Satan. It's a sign of demonic possession. And the medical intervention at that point was very straightforward. Burn the person at the stake. Centuries and centuries of viewing not only epileptic seizures as being somehow volitional, but something you bring about through having a soiled soul from getting into bed with the devil. And then, I don't know, 200 years ago or so, people began to figure out that no, actually, it's not satanic possession. It's something screwy with some of your ion channels. It's a disorder. It's a neurological disease. And overnight, people were not cured of epilepsy, but people were cured of the notion that not only was there something stigmatizing about it, but there was something volitional. And we learned how to subtract responsibility out of the notion of seizures. And what do you know? The world became a more humane place. And we already know another example of that, one that has occurred in my lifetime, but a little bit early for you, which is the trashing once and for all the notion that schizophrenia is caused by mothers. Schizophrenia is caused by mothers who have an unconscious Freudian pickled and bile secret hatred of their child and wish their child had never been born. And as we heard in the schizophrenia lecture, that should have been trashed completely in the 1950s with the development of the first antipsychotic meds. And what the psychoanalytic establishment did with that was say, these drugs just like calm somebody down. So it's easier to do the psychoanalytic work with them as to what their mothers did to them. And it wasn't until neuroimaging in the 1980s that suddenly hundreds of thousands of mothers were no longer responsible for having caused this nightmare of a disease in their child, and the impact of that, and the impact of the decades and decades before, of every sage telling every mother exactly how things work, is immeasurable. So we learned how to subtract volition, free will, out of that one, and the world became more humane. Much more recently, and again within my lifetime, when I was a kid, if I was sitting in school and the kid next to me wasn't learning how to read and whatever, and I would have an attribution, and everybody else in the classroom would have an attribution, including the teacher and the guidance counselors and the parents, maybe, which is, what can I say? They're kind of, they're unmotivated, they're lazy, they're not paying attention, and they're not very smart. And then along came exactly the sort of stuff we've been studying for 10 weeks, and people figured out, oh, sometimes there's little subtle architectural malformations in one layer of the cortex in one part of the brain. And as a result, you mix up letters of the alphabet, you loop them, you switch them, you three them, and oh, it's a learning difference. It's dyslexia. And overnight, suddenly, that was transformative, except for the fact that it hasn't been overnight. And transformative, though, when it has occurred, where you could read like 40-year-olds who will say, yeah, I finally got a dyslexia diagnosis 2 years ago. If only I had got that as a kid. I've spent my whole life hating myself for being lazy, for being stupid, and that's not what caused it. And that has been incredibly liberating. And not only does that take away that stigma, but it also teaches you how to better treat people, how to better teach people who are learning how to read, who have learning differences like that. So we subtracted blame and free will out of that one, and the world became more humane, and we're seeing other versions of that right now. I think we might be sort of at the cusp, and in most parts of this country, of realizing who it is you love, what sex you feel is most natural for you, is not a choice, is a biological phenomenon. We're beginning to learn more and more that extreme obesity is not caused by somebody with no self-control, and they're just self-indulgent, and they probably unconsciously hate themselves and want to do that. And there's like mutations in receptors for digestive tract hormones, which if you have them, you will be extremely obese, as will any member of your family. And we're slowly learning that one. That one, interestingly, amid implicit association tests, what unconscious biases people have. A wonderful finding is over the last 30 years or so that those tests have existed, implicit biases against virtually every outgroup out there has gotten better. Whoa, actual progress, with one exception, which has gotten worse over this time, which is implicit bias against people who are overweight. It's a mutation. It's a mutation. It's some of the gene variant stuff we know about. So maybe we're in the middle of a revolution with that, of learning how to subtract free will out of that one. Of course, we're not perfect at any of this anymore. We did, for the most part, figure out that mothers don't cause schizophrenia. But in the majority of juries and courtrooms in this country, somebody cannot be absolved of violence they committed while schizophrenic because they're not ready to say yet that there was no control there. So over and over, going from like, are you sleeping with Satan, to like, do you just have like self-control problems when you're looking at Oreos or something? What we've been seeing is two things. The biology that has dominated this class, teaching us over and over that there could be a dramatic division between the essence of who someone is and the biological chaos that just happened to wind up being superimposed on top and produces a quirk or ruins their life in the process. And what we're also seeing is that line between the essence and the biological hiccup on top, that line gets closer and closer to all of us all the time. Now, we've seen already some great examples, and just to review them, where the whole point is the subtleties of these. The subtleties starting off with not subtle, Phineas Gage, blow away somebody's frontal cortex is totally dramatic, but what we know by now is 100% damage to the frontal cortex? Okay. What about 99%? What about 98? What about 97? What about the fact that you've got more dopamine receptors there than the person next to you? The person down there has more synapses in this part of the frontal cortex. And the individual differences. The individual differences, and we've already seen some versions of that. Repressive personality. And we saw that is not a psychiatric disorder. These are not people who get diagnoses of depression and anxiety. Those are rule outs, in fact. And what is this? This is a predictor of people who can be quite successful. I mean, that's perhaps why you, during freshman year, spent your evenings studying like crazy while your roommate was out playing beer pong, or maybe the other way around in that relationship. But what we're seeing are individual differences in the nuts and bolts of this stuff. And you could begin to imagine already some of these hints. How is it that the person next to you is a little bit better at this or that in a frontal context, or a little bit worse, or how we are all on a continuum with this? Next example, a disease I alluded to in the very first lecture, Huntington's disease. It's the purest neurological disorder there is out there, the purest genetic neurological disorder. It's a mutation in a single gene. You get the mutation, you get the disease. You don't have it, you don't have the disease. And it's a movement disorder where you begin to get wild flinging of limbs, and it's eventually going to kill you because you can't coordinate swallowing. You choke to death on your saliva. It is a drag of a disease. And what you see is people had long noted something interesting, which is a number of years before Huntington's is a neurological disorder. You get behavioral changes in people. You start getting behavioral disinhibition. You get people doing socially inappropriate things. You get people suddenly shoplifting, suddenly exposing themselves, suddenly having affairs, suddenly getting involved in fistfights with people. This picture of disinhibition and societally inappropriate, sexually inappropriate, all sorts of versions of that. And whoa, what's the deal with that? And eventually brain imaging came along, which explained the deal with that. What everybody knew was Huntington's was a disorder of certain GABA releasing neurons in a motoric part of the brain. But when people then figured out, you could tell looking at people who were at risk for Huntington's because they came from a Huntington's family, or people where you knew they were going to get it because you had confirmed that they had the mutation, you could start imaging them years before the symptoms. And what emerged was years before Huntington's disease began, Huntington's disease had already begun. A few years before the motor pathway damage, there's frontal damage. That's in fact the first part that goes. And the age at which Huntington's typically gets people in their 40s or so generates a very interesting thing. In those few years beforehand, where it is mostly frontal disinhibition, where that is not a neurological disease, that is, take this family member to a psychiatrist or visits by the social workers or the police or any such thing. During that period, as noted, one of the things that you see is sexual disinhibition. And what studies have shown is during that period, people in that window of the early frontal damage of Huntington's out-reproduce their unaffected siblings by becoming sexually disinhibited. What are we looking at? We're looking at a gene which rots away your nervous system by the time you're 50 and kills you 5 years later. We're looking at a gene which in your late 30s, early 40s has a good chance of increasing your reproductive success. What we're seeing is a phenomenon in medical genetics called negative pleiotropy, a mutation that in fact confers an advantage early in life, and then inevitably the bill comes. And Huntington seems to fit that profile, and it is a single gene that has a mutation. We saw the other day temporal lobe personality, and that is not a diagnostic category. It's just a style. It is a certain style of individuals who have temporal lobe epilepsy in a particular location there. We saw OCD the other day. OCD, we're beginning to understand more and more on a neurobiological level. The the obsessions, the thoughts that just won't stop, the blasphemous thoughts, the worrying thoughts, the what if I just punched the person next to me? What if I just did this? What if I shouted out something right now? What if I didn't lock the door, even though I've gone back 3 times to check? And each time it has been locked and it's all fine. The obsessive stuff, people don't have much of a handle on the neurobiology of yet. But the compulsions, the tapping your fork umpteen times ritualistically before you could start eating, that kind of stuff, the motoric ritualism, that is beginning to be understood. Stick somebody in a brain scanner with OCD, and when they have a compulsive tic, what you see is increased activity in the motor cortex, because they're doing a ticking thing there, whatever, increased activity in the basal ganglia. And remember this loop we had, the amygdala stimulates the basal ganglia to cause, this is the habitual, this is the implicit. Somebody is not sitting there and thinking, I shall now tap the table 7 times with my fork. It's just this compulsion, this unstoppable thing. This pathway is strengthened while during the compulsive moment, PFC, its inhibitory projections onto all of these are weakened. So OCD, all sorts of hints for that now, that this is a biological disorder and it runs in families and all of that. We then saw schizotypal personality. It's not a disorder. It is in fact, very interesting trait to have in all sorts of traditional cultures, and done the right way in our own westernized cultures. And the key thing about it is it's not a mental illness. It is not a mental illness to believe in UFOs or to go to Comic-Con or whatever. These are quirks. These are quirks within this range of what we see as the normative sort of continuum on which we all dwell. We didn't know about most of these diseases not that long ago. Yeah, Phineas goes back to the 1840s, but most of these are far more recent, and only recent decades we've been learning these are ways in which your life could be deeply shaped, distorted, constrained, made less successful, more painful, more stigmatized, and whatever, due to just the sort of biology that's on a continuum among all of us. So what we're going to do here is begin to now look at some of the stranger outposts of exactly this phenomenon now that we have covered these. First one, I believe not mentioned before in the course, Tourette syndrome. Tourette syndrome, what everybody knows Tourette syndrome is about is scatology. People have tics, they have verbal tics, and they shout out obscenities at totally inappropriate times, and everybody knows about that. That doesn't begin to scratch the surface of what Tourette syndrome is about. The person shouts out totally inappropriate things. They bark. They make animal sounds. They get caught up on the sounds of words and have to shout it over and over. They get facial tics. They get motoric tics in their body. It simply takes over, and it is unstoppable. And people with severe Tourette's are having Tourette's type tics, I don't know, umpteen times a minute around the clock, and this is a disaster for them. And this completely impairs normal functioning at the extremes of it. And the most important thing, I mean, you get damage to the frontal lobe, and what you see there is it disinhibits stuff that's in there. Stuff you might think about, stuff you might, and if anybody knew you were thinking that, you would be so embarrassed and humiliated and damage the frontal cortex, and that hidden stuff comes out. People with Tourette's do not have the secret desire to quack like a duck, and it has been disinhibited in this disease. It's like you've got hiccups of the id. It's just superimposed on top. It's this neurological disorder that is discernibly separate from the essence of who somebody is with Tourette's and the disease that's superimposed on top. And we're beginning to learn more and more about it. There's genetic components to it. It's got a heavy genetic overlap with OCD, which is extremely interesting. Tourette's, in some cases, is probably an autoimmune disorder, as follows. You have a child, they come down with a strep infection, they're sick, and they run a high fever, and they get out the other end of it, and okay, they're feeling better, and suddenly, a week or two later, they suddenly explode into tics, facial tics, vocal tics, all of that. What is this about? And in these circumstances, there's even a name for this situation. It is called a PANDAS disease, panda with a plural, PANDAS disease, pediatric autoimmune neuropsychological disorder associated with streptococcus. What's the deal with that? You run a high fever when you have a strep infection, and in a subset of kids, the blood-brain barrier opens up. That tends to happen with fever, but in just the right part of the brain that you really don't want to have opened up, and in come white blood cells and immune factors that are supposed to be kept out of the brain, and they start forming antibodies against parts of the basal ganglia. And as a result, they attack there, and you get all sorts of stuff where motoric ticking and verbal ticking. What do you do with that? How do you treat somebody, a kid, who's just had an outburst of this 2 weeks after a strep infection? This is very rare, by the way. You treat them with an immunosuppressant, or you filter their blood to take out that autoantibody, that antibody against this part of it, and they're just fine then until they get their next high fever, and 2 weeks afterward, they burst into Tourette's-like ticking again. And I don't know the most recent numbers, but something like 20–30% of people with Tourette's, you look in their blood and they've got autoantibodies against parts of the basal ganglia, against motoric parts of their body. And what you see is the more extreme the ticking correlates with more atrophy in subparts of this area. Subparts that you could probably guess right now play an inhibitory role, and they get damaged in disinhibition in this random ticking sort of way, and it is extremely, extremely constraining of life for people with severe versions of it. So let's put Tourette's in a historical context. You get a kid, and in most cases onset is in kids overwhelmingly, and for reasons not fully understood, it tends to occur more often in girls than boys. A slight bias in that. But you've got a 10-year-old girl who suddenly starts cursing and blaspheming and doing all sorts of inappropriate movements, grabbing at her throat, grabbing at her crotch, grabbing all sorts of stuff like where suddenly there's an outburst of this, and it's 1528 or something, and what's your most likely description as to what's happening? They're possessed. They've been possessed by Satan, and that's why they're uncontrollably doing this blasphemous stuff. Those of you who are history fans, the movie The Exorcist, which I was never able to make myself sit through, but a kid where this is what Tourette's would look like in that circumstance. And what was the diagnosis back then? Demonic possession, and go in and do something medically appropriate, like burn him at the stakes. And now we treat people with Tourette's very differently. Years ago, I had a student in this class who had Tourette's. It wasn't severe. It was a couple of facial tics and a few hand sort of tic things. And early in the class, he came in and to tell me that he had Tourette's and sort of explaining how it worked. And he was really pleased that I already knew what the disease was. And he was explaining that sometimes in class he would make some inappropriate sounds or gestures. And in those circumstances, if it was disturbing to students around him, it was fine if we do something. And he spent the whole time doing this and then pulling his arm down. This was his Tourette's. This was the essence of him trying to control it. And, burn him at the stake? Nah, he's a child psychiatrist now. So all it does is take a few centuries for us to go from what do you do with this hiccup going on here, going from burning at the stake to this is someone who takes the MCATs in a room separate from everyone else so they don't disturb them with their barking sounds. We've made some progress there. Another domain of these getting stranger and stranger, something called hoarding syndrome. Hoarding syndrome, and any of you who will be parents one day will know that you are in the ballpark of getting a hoarding diagnosis, because everything, every bit of artwork, everything your child ever does, you will treasure and keep and pile up in some corner of the living room in a closet sort of thing. And that is not hoarding disorder. People with this psychiatric disorder hoard. They hoard everything. They hoard every newspaper, every magazine that has come into the house. They hoard used diapers from their child. They hoard rotting food. They hoard the packing materials. They hoard envelopes from letters. They hoard feces-covered toilet paper, and their house, their lives fill up with this. And broadly, there appears to be two different subtypes of pathological hoarders. There's the ones who can decisively tell you, I actually need this. Here's why someday I'm going to need this poop-covered piece of diaper. Here's why it's a good thing that I've been saving this for the last 10 years. They justify it. The other type is the person says, yeah, I really need to get around to cleaning up, but they can't make a decision as to what to get rid of. Okay, that sounds pretty bad. All of us know someone like that. No, we don't know someone like that. When you get a severe case of hoarding, these are people, for example, where at some point they are living in a little cave in their house with stuff piled up to the ceiling, and one of those piles collapses and smothers them or traps them in there because they can't get out. Hoarding extremes, these people will get killed by this disease. More weird stuff. These are some of my favorite diseases now. Something called Jerusalem syndrome. Jerusalem syndrome, there's a whole bunch of papers that have been published on this. Jerusalem syndrome, you can only get Jerusalem psychosis, it's often called that, instead if you are in the city of Jerusalem. And overwhelmingly, the people who get it are tourists, older American tourists, older American Southern Baptist tourists. These are people who their whole life have wanted to go and see the Holy Land, and finally here's the trip, and they go there, and they're going to be able to see the streets where Jesus walked, and something happens to them, which is they're suddenly surrounded by reality. It's like a modern city. There's traffic, there's pollution, there's people being rude, there's litter, there's pickpockets, all of that. And they're disappointed. They're devastated because they thought they were going to see, the little hamlet in which Jesus walked kind of thing, and they're disappointed. They're disappointed with a few additional sort of things that go along with it. Number one, they're typically alone. They may be in a tour group, but the key thing is at the end of the day, they are alone in their room. And typically, they're having a lot of trouble with jet lag. So they're lying in their room at night. Their whole life, they were looking forward to coming to this mythic, sacred place, and reality comes in, and it is psychotically disappointing. And this is what happens. Everyone who has a Jerusalem syndrome break at this point. They pull the bed apart, they pull out the sheets, shred them, take their clothes off, make a toga out of the sheet, and before you know it, they're out on a street corner of Jerusalem preaching to everybody about how they need to go back to their simple ways. Whoa, isn't that crazy? How bizarre is that? There are 50 cases a year at the main psychiatric hospital in Jerusalem, and this is the profile of these are. By definition, if you were going to get this diagnosis, by definition, you don't have a history of psychosis. That's a rule out. You get these people, and they're disappointed, they're crestfallen, all of their expectations, and they pour it into people have ruined this place with modernity, and I'm going to somehow get them. And before you know it, they're out there in their toga preaching, which has always struck me that, like, a solution for Jerusalem syndrome, or a way to prevent it, is to have like all of the sheets in the hotel rooms there be like checkered or paisley or something, because having a pure white sheet, I suspect, is very facilitating of it. 50 people a year. And the person is hospitalized for a week or two until their head clears, and they go back home to Biloxi or wherever it is they came from and are fine for the rest of their life. There's papers on this. This is an identifiable disorder. I read, interestingly, a recent paper showing an exact equivalent of Jerusalem syndrome among people who are doing their once-in-a-lifetime pilgrimage to Mecca. And they are expecting it to be the land where Muhammad strode and all, and it's a city, it's a modern way, and they have the same psychotic break. The same exact sort of thing where they are psychotically, pathologically intent on trying to turn the clock back. Another version of that is called Paris syndrome. And this gets about a dozen people a year, and overwhelmingly, they are Japanese tourists. I don't understand what this is about, but apparently in Japan, there's this incredibly idealized view of what France and Parisians are like. Everybody there is beautiful and thin and colliding through the streets filled with culture, and all the garbage smells like perfume, and there's a mime on every single corner. And they get to Paris, and it's like a city, and it's dirty, and people are rude, and it's all of that. And they have the same crash of disappointment. They don't wind up, on a street corner dressed as a mime telling people to go back to simpler ways. It's simply a psychotic break that happens in these individuals. About a dozen cases a year, 10 out of the 12 or so tend to be Japanese. But you have the flip side of it, a good version, Stendhal syndrome. Stendhal, French writer, who the first time he went to Florence, if you ever go to Florence, you will almost certainly have some mini version of Stendhal, because everywhere you look, there's a museum filled with incredible stuff, and everything is ancient and magnificent, and it is totally overwhelming after a while, where you want to scream enough with this beautiful stuff. And Stendhal syndrome is people get into a psychotic state of euphoria and awe and gratitude from seeing all this stuff. I don't know how many cases a year, but there's multiple papers on this. Look at all these ways that things can go wrong. You bark uncontrollably because your immune system has attacked part of your brain. You can't throw anything out, and eventually it collapses and suffocates you. You go to places and you have a predictable pattern of psychosis if you are the right person with the right sort of problems. And before you know it, you've shredded the sheets there, and it's off to the Jerusalem syndrome ward where they get 50 a year. So that's pretty strange. But then we get even stranger and into a whole terrain that's very, very puzzling. First, a disease called trichotillomania. You obsessively pull out your hair. People with trichotillomania will pull out all their eyelashes, all their eyebrow hair. They'll pull it just where it does very damaging, discernible things, and it can't be stopped. These are people who are compulsed to do this. Interestingly, it is not classified as a subtype of OCD, and OCD medication doesn't work on trichotillomania. But then you have trichophagia. trichotillophagia, where the compulsion is not just to pull out the hair, but to eat it. To eat the hair, to bite it, to chew it, to swallow it, all of that. And in extreme forms, this is somebody who goes over to somebody's house for dinner, and at one point they go to the bathroom and rifle through the host cabinet there to find a brush, a hairbrush full of hair, and they pull it off and they eat the hair. And then they go back to dinner. With this one, there is an extreme version of it called Rapunzel syndrome. You know, Rapunzel with the golden hair and all of that. And this is the trichophagia taken out to a truly pathological extent. This is someone who swallows so much hair that it forms a hairball in their stomach, which extends all the way up their esophagus and often all the way down into their gut. And this is life-threatening. And when the surgery is done and you pull out this clot, it's this big old ball of hair with a long, long thread of it there, what goes up the esophagus. Oh, just like Rapunzel with her hair, this can take this extreme of a form. If you don't fix it, if you don't go in there surgically, it bursts the stomach and the person bleeds to death. But there's even more strange things out there. Something called capgras delusion. The people around them who they know and loved don't seem like those people anymore. You are in there, you're in a hospital bed. Okay, it's often after a head injury. You're in there and your beloved comes in. And you don't think it's them. You think they're an imitation. You think the person is an imposter. You think they've been replaced by a robot. You can say, yeah, I know, it looks just like them, the same height, the same hair, all of that the same. Whoa, good job, guys. You really got it with the freckles there. Good. That one's a little bit off, but like, good job. Almost fooled me there. But you're an imposter. You're not really my loved one there. And this quickly sort of barrels into paranoia. Who is it who has taken your loved one and replaced them with this robot, with this? And this, for decades and decades, was classified as a psychiatric disorder with psychoses. And people would be hospitalized. It was first described in the 1900s or so in France. And this is contrasted with Fregoli syndrome. In this one, you believe one person can inhabit multiple bodies and that they keep switching them on you. Again, in some sort of paranoid state, you're sitting there and in comes, some big beefy Hungarian guy, and he goes out of the room, and 10 minutes later, in comes a very diminutive woman from Thailand, and you insist it's the same person. They went out and quickly changed and came back in. Named for Fregoli, Leopold Fregoli, Italian actor in the 19th century, who was famed for how quickly he could change costumes. You step out of the room as a big, beefy male Hungarian, and you come back in as a very diminutive Thai woman. Yeah, you just changed costumes. So Fregoli, notice this contrast there of what the delusion is. In the first case, you can have somebody who can look just like your loved one, be inhabiting an identical body, but it's not really them. Or in Fregoli, the delusion can be that this is the same person in these 3 different bodies that have come in. Yeah, they've come in 4 times so far today. Each time they're in a different whatever, but I can spot them and I know what they're up to. Frequently barreling into paranoia. So that was a psychiatric disorder until people started getting some insights into capgras. And with that, you need a different comparison between capgras syndrome and prosopagnosia, which is a disorder where you can't recognize faces. I read last night Jane Goodall has prosopagnosia, which I think is fascinating. I would assume only for humans, because she's just fine at recognizing the faces of lots and lots of chimps over the years. A face blindness, that's sort of a more generic term for it. You cannot distinguish one face from another. So, in Capgras delusion, your loved one is standing right in front of you, and you're saying, yeah, looks just like them. That's not them. They've been substituted. And with Fergoli syndrome, your loved one comes in and you say, I don't know, I've never seen this person before. Hi, good to meet you. My name is, they don't register. And it's only more recently that people have been beginning to figure out the neurology of both of these as follows. So you got your visual cortex here, and something people have known for a while is you then send, after doing the basic processing there, sends it to the parietal cortex. Don't worry, I've said that word maybe 3 times. It's not important. They send the information there, but the key thing is in 2 separate streams. That's the word that's used. 2 separate streams, and one of them seems to carry the information of who is this? What is this? This is a sea otter. This is my sibling. This is a who is this? And the other extreme is carrying what's their meaning? What's their emotional significance to me? What are my feelings about them? So if you get a stroke in this stream, and this is knocked out, you look at your loved one and you know, yeah, the freckles are in the right place, all of that, but they don't feel like my loved one. They feel like an imposter. You could recognize the concrete details that made them look just like your whoever, but because this pathway has been knocked out by a stroke, they don't feel like the whoever. And the only thing you can do as a conclusion is they've been replaced. This is a robot. This is an actor. This is an imposter. Conversely, if you get a stroke in this stream, you can't recognize the face of your loved one anymore. But here's what you see. You get someone like that, and the prosopagnosia after they've had stroke damage there, and their loved one comes in the room and they say, oh, hi, I don't believe we met. They have no recognition of them. They don't know who they are. They will tell you they've never seen this person before in their life, all of that. And then they'll say, but you know, I got a good feeling about them. They're a good egg. I sort of just have a sense that, yeah, I like the feel of that person. Or it will be autonomic. Their loved one walks in and they don't recognize the face, but their heart beats faster. And what you're seeing there is they can't do the concrete, who is this? But the feeling is coming through. So these are 2 ways that things can go wrong. More areas of wildness. Something called Munchausen's disease. Munchausen, or probably it's called Munchausen if you're actually literate. Munchausen disease is a factitious disorder where people fake medical symptoms. They go from doctor to doctor complaining about this or that pain, this or that problem. They will fabricate symptoms in themselves. They will swallow bleach to induce gastrointestinal whatever, and they are compulsively driven to invent medical maladies for them, and they wind up just completely lost in the medical system, often convincing doctors that indeed there is something wrong. So that's pretty weird, but like hold on to your hats. Then there's Munchausen by proxy, where most typically, in about 95% of cases, you are a mother of a child. In those cases, you induce the symptoms, you induce the illness in your child. Oh, you don't just go in and say, oh, they have sleep apnea during the night, they stop breathing, or they ran a big fever. Yes, you put all sorts of stuff. You put poisons in your child to generate fevers. You do unspeakable things. What typically happens is this is a child who has been through round after round of surgery, And they're often very young and in no position to say, Mommy makes me drink bleach now and then. Mommy rubs my skin over and over with sandpaper until I seemingly have this rash. Mommy does this. And what typically happens is you got a child in there who's gone through rounds of surgery, because the Munchausen by proxy mothers are often very, very good at this and convince the doctors. And almost always what it is some seasoned, cynical head nurse who has seen it all, who begins to notice the kid only spikes a fever right after mom has visited, and gets people to, say, set up a closed circuit TV camera in the room secretly. And that's when you see unbelievable stuff, like the kid has a feeding tube because of this imaginary gastrointestinal problem, and you see on camera mom disconnects the tube or mom disconnects the IV line and infuses some dog shit into it. And that child will have a raging infection for days afterward that nobody can tell. And no kid is in a position to say, wow, when nobody's in the room, mom comes in with a pillow and smothers me until I almost suffocate. And then you can see my electrolytes are all screwy afterward. Some such thing where mom injects me with our dog's feces into my circulation. This is a disaster of a disease, and it winds up killing about 20% of kids who have Munchausen by proxy. Actually, people in the field debate, is the diagnosis for the kid or the mother, or does it float in between? Or does it float between the two of them and the medical staff that is pulled into going along with this? And these mothers are often very, very good and very, very persuasive. What's the motivation for them? The really boring stuff is they get sympathy, they get acclaim, they get free whatevers, they get, Make-A-Wish Foundation for their supposedly dying from cancer child, and them to go on a luxurious trip to Disneyland. There's like material incentives, but that's not the interesting part. What it really drives is these are people who just have a compulsive need, an unstoppable need to somehow be enveloped in the medical world, to know all the staffers by first name, to be there around the clock with their sick child. Also, they walk down the hall and, the nurses will turn to each other, probing to and say, oh my God, have you ever seen a mother who is that devoted? She becomes friends with the nursing staff. She brings them brownies. She inveigles her way into their lives. And all of it is to be just enveloped in this medical system. Interestingly, a high percentage of women with Munchausen by proxy have had a history of some medical training, and almost always where they failed at it, where they had to drop out of the physician's assistant program, where they were never able to complete it. And it is some psychological, both wanting to be just enwrapped in that world and at the same time be telling them, screw you, you threw me out of nursing school. Look at how good I am. You have no idea that these symptoms are not for real. I'll show you. Incredibly pathological. There was a famous case of it that got turned into who knows how many made for TV movies. Gypsy Rose Blanchard? Gypsy, who was the daughter of a severe Munchausen by proxy mother, and it is a nightmare seeing what happened to that child until she eventually escaped, and early adulthood still kept in this neotenized, sickened state, the whole world believing she was paralyzed, in a wheelchair, had cerebral palsy, was developmentally delayed in a very serious way, and she secretly had a boyfriend that she had figured out online who she secretly convinced to kill her mother. So Munchausen by proxy. But whoa, that is nothing compared to some of the stuff we got coming now. Next we have somatoparaphrenia. What is that about? That is somebody who insists, this limb of mine, this isn't really mine. This is someone else's. This is prosthetic. This is a fake. Where's my limb? Somebody took it. Or it's over in that freezer. Or every time I try to get it out of the freezer, they move it again. It's this delusional belief that one of your limbs is not actually part of your body. How crazy is that? Or it can go one step further into Cotard syndrome, where you insist your entire body is not you because you're dead, you're putrefying, you're immortal, you're whatever. This isn't really my body is somewhere else entirely. Whoa, what a psychiatrically troubled disorder. And it turns out there's lesions. There's lesions in parts of the cortex that have to do with integrating your body feedback stuff. You see things like when someone is saying, this arm is not part of my body, this is not my arm, and you go in and the doctors touch it, and you get activation of the insular cortex. Ah, that's disgusting. This isn't me. This isn't me. And it's some sort of neurological problem that you see. Three different things that can cause it. The first is, yes, indeed, in about half of cases, it is slowly emerging schizophrenia. So it is indeed a psychosis. In most of the remaining cases, there's some sort of mild stroke damage to one area of the motor cortex and one area that integrates that information that gives you a sense of your body as a coherent whole. And it doesn't work very well, and this piece doesn't feel like me. Or the third circumstance, I had to read this one twice that seems so bizarre. There is an antiviral medication called acyclovir, and in 1 out of 1,000 people who take it, it induces a Cotard delusion that this isn't really my body anymore. And it clears out of their system, and they're fine at that point. This can go wrong. But oh, so much weirder at this point. We get to some of these final disorders here where I even have to look at them because I can never pronounce them correctly with acrotomophilia. This is a psychiatric disorder that was first described about 20 years ago. These are people who can only become sexually aroused by amputees. Then there's vorophilia, a sexual paraphilia, a fetishistic obsession with being cannibalized. You are only sexually aroused by the thoughts of being cannibalized. Two different subtypes. One of them is you are swallowed whole, and the other is you are chopped up into little bits and pieces first, and there's websites of people with this disorder talking with each other about what their particular cannibalistic fantasy. This is not people fantasizing that they are cannibals. We all know dozens of people like that. That one's a dime a dozen. This is in the opposite. That can go wrong. But then just to top it all, apodotermophilia, but this is someone who has shown ever since childhood has convinced that they are supposed to be an amputee. That the way in which they will feel like a whole person, the person who they were meant to be, is if this arm could be removed, if this leg can be removed, where they only have a sense of themselves being who they were always going to be if they have a limb amputated. In males, it's like 90% males, somehow losing a limb, having a limb removed, preserves your masculinity, and I didn't get that one at all. Another theory, this was another paper, that this is the most frightening thing you could imagine, losing a limb and wanting it to happen and going about getting it to happen is your chance to overcome the fear. Okay, then of course some psychoanalytic gibberish comes in that this is some sexual distortive hatred of your mother. There was one case, I read a case report about a guy who developed this disorder. When he was young, he saw another boy with an amputated limb and fixated on this boy. He was gay. And he fixated and thought the only way I could be worthy of him, equal to him, to be him, who knows what, is to have an amputated limb also. altered body dysmorphic disorder, gender identity disorder. I don't really understand where that one comes in. Body identity integrity disorder, which seems to be different from all these different theories. And then people look in the brain, and there's abnormalities in parts of the brain where, for example, you're not getting somatosensory feedback from the limb you want to have removed, so it just feels like this weird alien thing on you that is disgusting, and your insula activates. And what is most horrifying about it is people with this disorder, they've got chat groups. They talk to each other, they give each other advice on a doctor out in this place, or some doctor who lost their license but is willing to, for the right amount of money, amputate somebody's limb. Here's the way you can generate an industrial accident that will cost you a limb. This is a real psychiatric disorder. These diseases didn't exist 100 years ago. The wild ones I just went through didn't exist 10, 20 years ago. We don't even have names right now for some of the ways in which your biological luck can go way, way wrong and ruin your life. But we will be getting those names. And we get more and more of these, and we get more and more of these diagnoses, and eventually we're all going to have a few of them. I do not have OCD, but whenever I go up a flight of stairs, I have to count the steps. I cannot stop myself from doing it, no matter how irritating it is. I've got some other things like that I can't. Okay, here's what I've been doing today. This morning, I thought about the scene in Harry Potter 1 where Hagrid first comes in and says, "You're a wizard, Harry." So I think about how cool that is, and then I think about Hagrid saying it, and then I wonder if I could do his Scottish accent. And then I realize my lips are moving, and then I think, stop screwing around, you got to get ready for class. And then I think about the scene where Hagrid first comes in and says, "You're a wizard." I don't know how much of this morning I wasted with her. We all got stuff like this going on. With 600 people in this class, a heartbreaking number of you have struggled with depression or anxiety, but there's some of you there, I will be willing to bet, who have struggled with trichotillomania or bulimia or some of these, and these all strike close to home. So what are we going to do when we get to the point where we all have a couple of names for these, and we all suffer from some of them, and we all have to consider the good luck we had versus the one whose life is completely derailed by it? Okay, one of the scary outcomes is you better bet as soon as people get these diagnoses, that's going to be such a great opportunity to deny them medical insurance or fair housing or employment or things like that. That is going to happen every time. And every sort of rule and law out there about genomic privacy is not going to work in the long run. So that's the bad side of it. The good side is we all learn to extend this umbrella of who compels compassion out of us and who counts as someone whose life has been done in by one of these disorders. And we've learned in recent decades that, yes, one way for your brain to betray you is schizophrenic hallucinations. Another way is if you can't leave the house because you have to get a symmetrical thing with your shoelaces or something, that's a way in which your life could be ruined. Absolutely. And as we learn more of that, we learn over and over what's the obvious thing, which is if you had a couple of more receptors of this or a few less of that or whatever, there, but for the grace of biology, go you, we're all on a continuum with this. And what you realize is eventually this supposed boundary between the essence of who we are and the biological tumult superimposed on it, that boundary, as it gets closer and closer, we realize that's a completely false boundary. There's no difference. And at the end of the day, being healthy is having the same diseases that most other people do, because we all have some of these. So, what does this mean about the nature of life and that we're machines, we're biological machines? We're biological machines. We're made of the same building blocks as a sea slug. The unique thing about us is, as far as I can tell, we're the only biological machines who know we are biological machines, but we're biological machines. And like, what to make of this? And this is where people often get very, very uncomfortable, and is pretty reliably a subset of people in this class, because what that's beginning to attack is this treasured pretense that we all have that we are unique, that we are unmatched, that we are this flickering flame of individuality, and all this science is going to do is come along and extinguish that stuff and explain more and more about less and less, and all the mystery will disappear. This was wonderfully summarized, this classic science fiction story by Arthur C. Clarke, called The 9 Billion Names of God, where in it a bunch of Tibetan monks with some super duper 1950s computer start spitting out the names of God, all 9 billion names, a metaphor for attaining the unattainable there, the sublime. And as the story goes, as each new name comes out of the computer, one of the stars in the sky goes dark. This is the metaphor for why all of this is worrisome. That is, those scientists go and inadvertently explain everything and turn it all into mechanism and turn us into machines, that with each new factoid, one of the stars in the heaven is going to go dark. This is the last thing you have to worry about for a number of reasons. First off, the fact that we turn out to have mechanistic stuff going on underneath the surface in no way should rob whatever we feel about what is on the surface. You can turn Bach into a bunch of contrapuntal rules, and you could turn a gazelle leaping into a bunch of biomechanics equations, and the fact that you could do that doesn't make one difference in terms of emotionally what the music can do to you, or watching a gazelle leap can do to you. Just because there's more structure than we initially suspected shouldn't rob us of anything of the wonder of what the behavior coming out at the other end looks like. But for another reason as well, we shouldn't worry about this, which is science is never going to go and inadvertently explain everything. Because what this whole course has been is every time they answer a question, they generate 10 new ones. This is the nature of science. Haldane, J.B.S. Haldane, he was the guy who gave us I'd Lay Down My Life for Two Brothers or Eight Cousins, had another wonderful quote. He said, "Life is not only stranger than we imagine, life is stranger than we can imagine." And that's exactly the point. The purpose of science is not to cure us of mystery. Its purpose is to constantly reinvent it. What should one do with all this information? And what people are often totally frazzled with by this course right around at this point is, like, it's so damn complicated and nothing causes anything. Everything else is modulating something else. Everything is a predisposing factor. Nothing actually causes it. It is so complicated, and there's so many ways in which things can go wrong. How am I supposed to do anything about this? How am I supposed to fix any of this? And this could easily become paralyzing. Where we begin to appreciate what might you do about this is to appreciate kind of where you fit into the world at this point. Two anecdotes. First one, I can't even remember if it was in the movie about Oppenheimer, but apparently after the bomb went off the very first time, he said, "Now even physics has known sin." The second anecdote is about my father. My father was an architect and an architectural historian, and he taught architectural history at a crappy little night school in Brooklyn, which he wanted to teach in because it was filled with nothing but like immigrants who were working as draftsmen during the day trying to get their architectural licenses, exactly what his trajectory had been. And once I went to sitting on one of his classes, and he was an amazing lecturer, and he was like singing arias to tell you about acoustic material. And one of the other things he was doing is at one point, he's like putting up pictures of like some of the great, glorious things in architectural history. And yeah, of course, saying, oh my God, how inspiring, how wonderful. That's not what he's doing. He's putting up pictures, the Palace of Versailles and the pyramids of Giza and all of that. And he's saying throughout history, architects over and over and over have just been the whores of the wealthy, building in their palaces, building in their mausoleums, just being their toadies. I don't want to see you go out and be the whores of the wealthy and the powerful. I want you to get fair housing. And he's going on and on like that, yelling at these people. These are people who are not going to be building the Palace at Versailles. If they're lucky, they're going to be doing an illegal renovation on somebody's garage in Canarsie in Brooklyn or something. And I thought this was the stupidest thing I'd ever heard in my life. And it wasn't until after a while that I sort of sensed that he was in fact doing something very, very respectful to these folks. That even if they're out there and their destiny is to do illegal renovations on a garage somewhere in Brooklyn, even if they have the capacity to sin. Some secular version of it, to do construction that is unsafe, to do something that is corrupted, that even they can do it. So now even physics has known sin. Even somebody doing a renovation on a garage can know some secular version of sin. What's the punchline here? You guys are not the first atomic bomb. You guys are not night students who are like unlikely to ever get a license and do that. You are not people where it is marginal whether or not you are ever going to have an influence. You guys are going to. You are privileged. You are lucky. You are educated. You have clean running water. You probably have a home to return to at the end of each day. You are among the lucky ones. And part of what that privilege is going to do is you are going to be among the powerful ones. You're going to face some circumstance where you have to decide whether to pump somebody's stomach when they've taken a whole overdose of something because they can't live any longer. You at some point are going to be someone deciding whether or not a budget in the legislature you're in commits money to this mental health problem. You are going to be an elected official. You're going to be a prosecutor. You're going to be a judge. This class has already produced one U.S. senator and a couple of representatives, and you guys are going to go out and be influential. People are not going to be looking at you and saying, oh, let's gratuitously praise them on the fact that they could do rotten, like garage renovations in some place or other. You guys are going to have power. And the key thing that comes out of this is, oh, it's so complicated, it's so complicated, it's impossible to do anything, it's impossible to make anything better. The more convincing it seems that nothing can be done, the more you guys have to be the ones to do it. Because you guys are the privileged, lucky ones positioned to do that. Exactly as that quote from the other week ago, the less forgivable the act, the more you have to forgive it. The less lovable the person, the more you have to find the means to love them. The more it seems that any rational conclusion is, nothing could be made better, and I'm helpless, the more you got to do it. Because if you don't, nobody else will be in a position to. So, on that note, good luck with the process of doing that. And even if it's complicated, that's never an excuse. Something has to be done. So do it cautiously, do it prudently, do it humbly, all of that. But somebody's got to, and you will be best positioned. Good luck with that process. And just as a final thought, you are not going to have to choose between being scientific and being compassionate. They're completely compatible.